This is where we grew up. In raging storms and freezing temperatures. The west coast of Norway demands something special from who you are and what you wear. In these conditions, you need to trust your clothing. Function followed by form. We're beyond fashion. We are what legends and fishermen have been wearing since 1853.
Welcome everybody. I hope everybody is now able to see all of our panelists and everybody here. First and foremost, a huge thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Monique Kelly. I'm one of the co-founders at the Wao Charitable Trust. Our mission is really to inspire, educate and enable communities to transition to a better future. And we do this through events such as the Wao Summit. And tonight I am so happy to have this panel together. And I think that the fact that we are doing it virtually as well as in person, because some of our events are in person, is been a real journey for us, a real one of learning about how to connect in a time when connection is not actually easy or manageable. So I would like to thank all of our guests here, David Woods, Alex Baker, Rowan McMahon, Isabel Hupper. I am now going to hand over, or very soon, over to David, but just a couple of things for everybody looking in. We have a Q&A at the bottom of your screen. So if you have any questions during the discussion, please just pop them into there. Our panelists are going to see that pop up and we will try and answer as many of those as possible. And other than that, I will let the conversation begin. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, and thank you, Monique. It's great to be virtually in Wanaka again, and with three very experienced panelists. I'm really looking forward to this session. We have Isabel Hutter from Westpac's Asset Management Unit, Alex Baker from Kainga Ora, and Rowan McMahon from the Climate VC Fund. My name's David Woods, and I'm a director of the New Zealand Centre for Sustainable Finance and also of New Zealand Green Investment Finance. And I'm very sorry that we're not all physically in Wanaka this year, but circumstances being what they are, we're lucky we can get together. The way we're going to run this session is to ask each of the three panelists to talk a little bit about how they see the topic of reimagining capitalism, what they think is going on, and then we'll pull it back together and discuss things among ourselves and also answer as many as we can of the questions you pose to us, and hopefully it'll be an interactive discussion. As Monique said, we'll use the Q&A. We will not use the chat, but I did put in the chat just as we were starting the link for a copycat session that follows this one at 2 a.m. run by the Global Impact Investing Network, who are also going to discuss reimagining capitalism. But I think you'll find that the discussion around this table is higher quality. So without any further ado, Isabel, would you like to go first and just tell us how you see reimagining capitalism?
Kia ora, and thank you very much for having me here tonight. I'm very excited to be here with you. For me, reimagining capitalism means integrating social and governance and environmental aspects in any kind of business or investment decision, and together having those design a better future. Growing up in a household where sustainability was at the core and was a really strong value, and going to a school that reflected those values was one aspect of my upbringing. The other one was growing up in an environment that was very heavily focused on finance and the economy, being Frankfurt in Germany. Those aspects didn't stand at odds for me. For me, it was always very clear that both of these together could shape what we want, and they can shape the society that we want to thrive in. For me personally, it is really important, and having both of these together make the decisions and make the consideration that I take in my everyday life. Being a sustainable investment analyst for the Westpac KiwiSaver and investment arm BTNZ, it means that I support the team in embedding social and environmental consideration. It means that we consider aspects that we want to invest more in, aspects that solve the climate crisis, for example, or aspects that lower impact on our ecosystem and lower the amount of water that companies are using. It also means that we engage with companies and signal what we want them to do more of and support them on the journey. And often that engagement and that conversations that we have with companies may take some long time, but we think it's really important to make sure that businesses understand where we want society to go and where we want businesses to transition to. We also think it's important to exclude some of the companies that we do not want to see that much of and that do not fully align with our values. In my personal life, for me, reimagining capitalism means investing in those companies that I want to see more of. It means buying those organic potatoes, for example. It means supporting our ecosystem, our environment center down here. And it means for me to walk and cycle more, because that's what I'm very passionate about. I think it's really an important aspect to have a thriving society and also to lower your footprint and be active. In summary, reimagining capitalism means that integration of social, environmental, and economic aspects together, forming a society and an environment that we want to thrive in and that we want to live in.
I always do that. Thank you, Isabel. Alex, how about you?
Thanks. How's it going? As David mentioned, I work at Kāinga Ora, and there I manage the sustainability strategy team. My role at this Wao conference is actually to talk about buildings and communities tomorrow in the building and the better buildings session. But as I've also worked as an accountant and in corporate finance in the past, when I saw the Redefining Capitalism session that was on today, I couldn't resist putting my hand up for it. So thanks again for having me. There are three key things that I want to talk about today, and those are how a capitalist society does not enable good social or environmental outcomes. Pretty much everything is geared money first, that it's very difficult for any participant in our society to actually derive a purpose and a meaning from their work. And that has big implications for New Zealanders and for people in general, and actually also how our version of capitalism, or in our version of capitalism, consumption is king and it's destroying our environment. When I put my hand up for this, I hadn't quite realized how hard it would be to synthesize ideas down to 5 minutes of coherent content, but here goes. Start with, it's hard to debate that capitalism hasn't been an effective structure for organizing our society. In recent human history, we've seen unprecedented growth and wealth, billions of people lifted out of poverty. From a health perspective, it's pretty hard for a human in the modern world to die from anything, apart from maybe COVID. And humans are achieving now more than they ever have before. The problem is that capitalism has also given us a structure where so much harm is able to occur at the same time. From an environmental perspective, we're staring down the barrel of an impeding climate catastrophe. From a biodiversity perspective, species are going extinct at a faster rate than they ever have before. And pollution is so pervasive that it's in our water and in our food. There are plenty of social issues as well. We have mental and physical health crises. People have a drastically reduced ability to live or to afford to live in the way that they want. Equality and deprivation are becoming major issues. in New Zealand. And actually for people of my generation, hope, purpose and meaning is missing from their lives. It's very hard to hope and have meaning when you're staring down the barrel of a society that's going away that you don't believe will lead to a future that you want to participate in. So I think to begin the conversation about doing something different and better, we first need to ask the question of capitalism itself. Have humans succeeded and grown because of capitalism or in spite of it? We then need to ask, what about capitalism is causing all of those poor outcomes that I mentioned before? And then to finish off, I think we need to imagine what a system would be like where there are incentives to innovate and develop and to be prosperous and generate value, but also those aspects that lead to the degradation of our environment and our social structures also go. I might leave it there, actually. That's my quick take on it anyway.
Okay, Alex, well, you certainly managed to keep within your 5-minute limit and brought up some really interesting ideas, which we'll come back to in a couple of minutes. But let's first ask Rohan to say what he thinks.
Tēnā koutou, no ahitereria ahau a rā te whenua moi moi a, ko McMahon toku whānau, ko Rowan toku ingoa. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Good evening, everyone. I'm Rowan. I'm the token Australian in your group tonight. And I'm a partner at the Climate Venture Capital Fund, which is a relatively newly created venture fund that's investing in low emissions technologies. We believe that one part of what we can do to redefine capitalism is to price the externality and to accelerate progress around decarbonisation, to mitigate climate change, and to reduce the societal risk, the environmental risk and the social risk that climate change is. But we're not averse to seeing that as a commercial opportunity at the same time. So that's an example of one thing that I think we can all do to redefine capitalism, is to vote with our wallets, to vote with our feet, to do the things that are in front of us that are pertinent to the issues at hand. So we know we have a biodiversity crisis. We know we have a planetary crisis in the atmosphere, and we can act on those things. And in doing so, we can do our part to reform capitalism. Some of my background that might be relevant for our kōrero this evening is I've spent quite a lot of my career working in and around human rights issues and environmental issues, because they're personal for me, they're important to me. And I think that that's something I'd like to do, is to make the professional personal and vice versa. There's no reason why you should check your values at the door of what you do. And if you take that stance, then you can actually achieve change in what you do professionally. And that's the way I've decided to live my life. So that's how we do things around here. I think once you start to look at that capitalist system that Alex and Isabel have outlined so eloquently, you realize that there is inequality and deprivation on our very doorstep. Here in Auckland, in Tamaki Makaurau, for example, we have a situation where the housing crisis is getting worse, where housing affordability is going down while rents go up. The cost of living is going up. Inflation is at 10-year highs. And we are throwing more and more people off the back of the bus. That is our current economic system. And so that desperately needs reform. I'm very happy to see that there have been some reforms in the last few years. For example, the increases to the minimum wage, which I think are a really great way to make sure that people have a fighting chance of getting decent work. It should be a living wage, but increases to the minimum wage are steps in the right direction. Also important reforms to the welfare system that have helped to make the welfare system less punitive on people who it should be helping. There is so much that government needs to do to reform itself, and that's a big part, I guess, of tonight's conversation. But I guess I try to make it personal once again to just to finish off by pointing out that we can do a lot as individuals. We are consumers and investors. We get a shot at the ballot box every couple of years where we can choose to outline views that we agree with. We hope to find candidates that we can agree with, and you know, we can go on climate strikes. We can do things that affect positive change in a very meaningful way. So there's a lot to be done. And thanks again for the opportunity to Monique and to David for inviting me along for the chat tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Rohan, and thank you all.
Just
sorry,
a little bit ahead of time. Would it be okay if I said a little bit more?
Yes, please.
Awesome, thank you. I might just go on to talk a little bit about those three questions that I outlined. Have we succeeded in growing because of capitalism or in spite of it? What about capitalism is causing these poor outcomes? And how do we need to imagine a system where some of these incentives change? Just to start with that, have we succeeded or grown because of capitalism or in spite of it? In my view, as an economic and social structure, capitalism hasn't been the defining force that has enabled the boom in wealth and technology that we've all experienced. I believe that there are a plethora of ways that our society could have been structured and capital markets could have been structured that would have enabled that. The critical factor driving that innovation that changed the world was not the promise of profit as a result of hard work, driving all of those innovators and all of those creators to try and do something. What it came down to was actually that they had the capacity and that society supported them to be able to take risk, to be able to innovate, and then supply them with capital. That access to capital could have come from many different market structures. The capacity to innovate, however, comes from people actually being driven by purpose and being supported by their society to take risks. And those are two things that I think are actually areas that in New Zealand are at risk if we continue down the trajectory that we're currently on. What's the problem? Capitalism as a mantra, again, I believe, has created a narrative where profit becomes a genuine goal. So as long as we're generating a profit, we're contributing to society, or so the saying goes. And what that means is that for many organizations and for many individuals for a long time, any means has been justified by that end. And what that means is that literally anything is okay. That includes, a number of things, to be a bit blunt, like manipulation of the regulation and of the wealth distribution mechanisms that actually govern our society and the markets in which trade and industry happens in New Zealand. Again, in my opinion, our economic and political society is one that has now been so heavily manipulated that it's effectively what you might call sanctioned corruption. If you were an alien visiting New Zealand and holistically assessing the way that our markets operate and whether or not they are fair, I think that you would actually conclude that they're corrupt. And then someone would explain to you, oh no, all this stuff is actually happening within the rules that our society has created. So there's the problem, right? We've created these rules that enable our markets to operate in a way that doesn't actually lead to good outcomes being achieved. And from an environmental perspective, consumption is the big issue. That pursuit of profit has resulted in a civilization where there is an endless appetite to consume goods and services. And it's the consumption of those goods and services that actually allows our economic system to keep spinning. Businesses driven by profit actually need individuals to consume in order to derive a profit. And actually governments, when it comes to measuring growth, again, they need individuals to consume to continue to spend money in our economy to demonstrate GDP growth. In some ways, actually, as an individual, the most important contribution that many of us might make is to buy lots of stuff. Lastly, I wanted to end on what next and how can we reimagine something different. On one hand, I personally, and probably lots of you, have done very well from the capitalist social economic structure that we live in. And that makes it really difficult to have conversations about changing. But on the other hand, we are living in this system that conceptually is driving our world to the brink. From the perception, a new system, it's really difficult to define what that should look like. We're not talking about switching from what we have now to something else that we are aware of that currently exists or has existed in the past. We're actually heading into a future that's unknown and that, for good or bad, will be unlike anything that we've faced before. And that means that we need economic, social, and political systems that also are unlike anything that we've had in the past, but are actually fit for purpose for the future and to govern the future that we want. In particular, that system needs to balance the ability to retain incentives for innovation and development with answering questions like how do we repair our environment and how do we avoid poverty and inequality. Again, coming back to what I think is possibly the key driver of all of this, consumption. We have an endless desire to consume more stuff. The need to consume this stuff actually is only a symptom of the fact that I think it's very difficult for someone living in the modern world to actually feel a sense of purpose or meaning, particularly from the way that they engage with our economy and with our society as a worker or as a contributor. And as a result, people are encouraged to find meaning in other things, my new car, my new kitchen, my new phone, or whatever it is, rather than in their contribution to society. They don't come home from work and say, what a great day, this is how I contributed to society today. And that is a genuine lack of purpose for our people. And again, this is perpetuated by the fact that our capitalist structure survives on consumption, but having people in meaningful work is not a driver of profit and of organizations' bottom line. So I think that we need a system that reflects these challenges, that's flexible. Our future will change, and we need to be able to be flexible to change with it. And we need to create a system where every New Zealander or internationally can actually contribute in a meaningful way to our society.
Thank you, Alex. It's a very good tactic to take 3 minutes of your first 5 and then get an extra 6 afterwards. So, but some very interesting views coming out of all of that. And if you're referring to aliens, I think from the point of view of your audience tonight in Wanaka, the aliens are still stuck in Auckland, so people won't be too worried. But you talked about a few interesting things. You talked about how capitalist society doesn't help social and environmental outcomes. You talked about some of the negatives of capitalism. Reminded me a little bit of an analogy with Winston Churchill saying democracy was the worst possible form of government except for all the other ones that had been tried. So what is the alternative? What way would we want to go? Would we want to have a socialist state in extremis, as in North Korea, or something like that? You talked about consumption being king. Let's talk in a couple of minutes maybe about the circular economy and this whole philosophy of reuse, repair, and refurbish, recycling being sort of fourth on that list of mantras, and some of the other alternatives. You talked about inequality, and that came up in all three from all three of you. So if we properly manage a just transition in New Zealand to a low carbon economy, is that going to result in a redesign of capitalism anyway? Is that going to give us a fairer society? In order to do that, do we need to price carbon at $170 a ton, which is the 2030 price that Canada will use, and price oil at $18 a ton, and see what the scenarios look like in that balance, because they'll certainly look differently than they look in some of the figures we see today. Are we raising a generation of children who will have lower standards than their parents for the first time in it's something that's already happening in Europe, but it's something that seems to be looming in New Zealand as some parts of society experience a wealth transition from parents to children that are creating some very well-off and wealthy 25 and 30-year-olds and younger, while others are finding it's very difficult to pay off the mortgage before you retire. So how is all of that working? And Isabel, you talked about integrating social and environmental and ESG measures into everything. And we've seen that really take hold in the investment markets, but we've also seen a bit of a kickback to it in some situations, with shareholders saying, we want ESG, yes, but we're not going to sacrifice profit completely for the sake of ESG. So where is the right balance? So I think there's some really interesting things that we can talk about. And perhaps we could talk first about whether we think that the just transition will help us move towards a fairer society in New Zealand. And I'll come to each of you in turn, but may I just say to the audience, if you have questions, you have two ways of asking them. Either put them into the Q&A and say which of the panelists they're for, if you want them for somebody specific, or if you want, you can raise your hand and we can unmute you. But I'd prefer if we can manage through the Q&A, because it's hard for us to see all the other methods of asking questions. But Rowan, why don't you go first on the just transition and what it will mean?
Thanks, David. I'll give it a go. I think the answer is no, but I think the answer is at least we might not make it even worse than it is. I think most people on this webinar would be aware that climate change is a kind of intersectional type of issue that's going to have a lot of distributional effects that are essentially worse on people with less money and in more exposed areas than on the rest of us. So a just transition is designed to head that off, and so you might push adaptation measures towards those who are most exposed. You might invest ahead of time to sort of help those who you think are most at risk. That is necessary and should happen, and it should be something that government policy backs, but it won't, all that will do for broader distributional issues within the economy around inequality, the housing crisis and the like, is not make it worse rather than making it better. I would like to see our climate response be something that we disproportionately use to drive those better social outcomes. So in Alex's space, for example, you know, the housing stock that we have in New Zealand is not that flash in terms of the quality of insulation and heating that it provides. If we, and that obviously has emissions impacts that we will need to deal with in a climate response. Why not go a little further and say, well, we can, you know, through healthy home standards and the like, we can actually rebuild the housing stock to be better for people's welfare, better for people's respiratory systems, better for people's ability to get a proper education, rather than just saying, oh, well, let's just make sure we deal with the emissions. The emissions is the minimum we have to deal with, but we also are going to, as taxpayers, be funding these sorts of initiatives. We might as well get two for the price of one and get an environmental benefit around the emissions reduction, but also, you know, why not lobby your favorite legislator to make it a social benefit as well? Make it a program that actually picks people up rather than just says, oh, everyone's equal, because unfortunately the reality of things is our society is not equal, and the impacts will be disproportionately felt by certain groups who deserve a fairer shot at things.
And isn't in some ways capitalism as we understand it in New Zealand synonymous with house ownership? And the house is normally the biggest asset that a family has, and the spread between housing assets and financial and other assets is quite different than in many other countries. So, Isabel, do you think that we can move people away from housing being king and at the same time create a fairer balance for people in what we might or might not then call a capitalist environment?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I guess it was one of the reasons KiwiSaver, a KiwiSaver system was set up back in 2007, was taking account that a lot of people had invested quite a lot of their money into houses and had not considered that, you know, when it comes to retirement, you can unfortunately not eat your house. It doesn't taste very good. As Alex will shortly certify us here. The good thing about that is if you've invested in it and you have got an income at that time, you do not have to pay for your rent anymore. So that's a good outcome, but it's better if you have got alternative income levels. And that is why the KiwiSaver investment scheme has been set up. And if you think about it, the ability for the government to top up some of your investments and provide you, I mean, it's $500. It may not seem a lot, but it's an extra $500 that you get for free. If you try to put away as much money as you can, is a really good help. In general, I would also say it's really important to consider what you want to achieve. So some of the aspects that Alex has mentioned earlier around profit, you know, what does profit actually mean? We can say that profit means more than just money, right? We want to have more than just a financial outcome for any company. So having that kind of lens on when you are making your personal investment decisions, you know, when you buy your groceries, but also when you think about what KiwiSaver you want to invest in, or what bank you want to bank with, what is the house that you want to invest in? Do you want to have that house that is lowering the respiratory levels that we have got in New Zealand that are really, really high for an OECD country? And I'm down here in Southland, and they're really terribly high, unfortunately. In addition also to some of the diesel diesel vehicles that we have got in New Zealand and that we're reliant on because of some of the longer distances, which is adding to some of the asthma levels. So considering the outcomes that you want to see in the future and considering how those outcomes can shape a different system. So thinking about that system in terms of how can we tweak it, because we will never have a perfect system, but we can think about little tweaks here and there, and we can think about what are the things that we want to see more of, what are the things we want to see less of, and how can we make sure that it trades off well, and how can we make sure that we are not impacting, if we're making any changes, that it's not impacting more than it should do. It should have a lower impact. So trade-offs are really, really important for us to consider in any kind of transition. And a just transition as it is, there are some really good examples that I can refer to. Considering what that means often means that it takes time. Some of the examples in Germany and phasing out coal have taken quite a long time and had meant that the organization that was phasing out coal had to set up other ventures to make sure that they can then finance the rehabilitation of the environment and finance workers finding new work or retiring them early. So taking account of employees in itself is really important, making sure that they have a chance if you're moving away from one source of renewable energy as such is really, really, really important, because we want to make sure that they're part of our future. They cannot be left out.
Thank you, Isabel. And then we also get this encouragement to think of products as services, to own things rather than, to use things rather than own them. So if we started to move that way with housing, if we started to move that way with recycling clothing, with reusing all sorts of things in our environment and live within planetary boundaries, what sort of opportunities would that create? Generally, when people talk about the circular economy, they talk about it being good for the environment, but not having any great social outcomes other than more employment. And just, some of the things you're talking about, Isabel, and some of the background from Germany and other countries would suggest we're heading for bigger government in New Zealand. And you talk about the trade-offs. Are we willing to accept bigger government? But Alex, I have a question for you before we go to one from the audience. In your antipathy towards capitalism generally, have you thought about universal basic income, which is a concept that's been thought about and tried in some countries? Generally speaking, it has been trialed and then not kept on, but do you think it would help to solve some of our problems?
Tough question. For me, probably the thing about a universal basic income is the incentive structure that it puts in place for the individual. And I think that something that's probably quite difficult to imagine is actually the structure that exists for someone who's most likely to benefit from a system like that. Because the reality is that if you are a New Zealander who is caught in the poverty cycle in New Zealand, it is very, very difficult to break away from that. So the advantage of something like a universal basic income in that situation is it is actually a guarantee. It's a support net, so that instead of having to, jump on the treadmill and rinse and repeat just to make ground, and often when I say make ground, I mean put food on the table for your children, to buy clothes for your children, to pay for power so that you can, let's face it, not heat your house to a healthy temperature, because our houses are too poor a standard for poor people to actually be able to do that in New Zealand. But those types of decisions force people who are vulnerable in New Zealand into interacting with our society and with our economy in a way that's not very beneficial for them. And something like universal basic income actually gives them a guarantee, and it means that they can go away and invest in themselves and potentially come back to that economy with something actually better to offer, something that allows them to break away from what is otherwise a very difficult cycle for them. So I think I think that there are a lot of pros to something like universal basic income. I suspect for most New Zealanders, you would find that it didn't make much difference at all. We'd pay slightly more tax probably, and we would receive a little bit of income probably. But I suspect that if you're someone that's living in a kainga ora house, or someone that's in a vulnerable situation, or actually someone that contributes to our society as a volunteer, I don't know how many mothers there are in New Zealand, diligently raising their children and adding, and investing in our future through the prosperity of their children. But that's largely unrecognised work in New Zealand, and something like a universal basic income actually recognises that as well. So, it's not an area that I know a lot about, but I think that there probably are quite a few pros that we should be considering. Hey, I'll leave it
And
there.
as you said, it does tend to take away incentive, which complicates it a little bit. And some countries have tried to do a sort of universal basic income by subsidizing up the lower waged and taxing down the better paid so that everybody has more or less the same disposable income. That used to be a more popular model than it is today. And in the last 20 years, we've seen all sorts of inequalities to start to develop. But I'd like to move across to a couple of questions that have come in from the audience. And the first one is from Ewan Mackey. Since you've put your name on the Q&A, I think I can use it. Asking what methods the panel would recommend to ethically use disposable income that has good socio-environmental outcomes, but also small or fair economic outcomes for the individual. Now, you're going to get an answer from Isabel, which says invest in Westpac funds. You're going to get an answer from Rowan that says invest in the Climate VC Fund, and from Alex, buy a Kango or a house. But Rowan, would you like to go first?
Well, I'll try, but you've already given my best answer, David. So I think that's a tough one for me. I mean, your question, Ewan, says you already invest in ESG funds. So it sounds like you're already looking at the likes of Mindful Money or other comparison sites to understand the ESG properties of the investment options that you're taking. I think that's the right thing to do. In your role as a consumer, you can think about what values you are bringing to your consumption decisions. I also encourage you to think about some of the charitable options that are in front of you, which often have a really purposeful impact. I don't see magic answers there because it is complex. But like I said at the beginning, we do what we can, and if you bring that lens to every part of your decision making, whether it's as a consumer or as an investor, and is it as an investor in shares, is it as an investor in funds, then I think you're on the right track. And what's really great to see is that there is more transparency and better data to help us make these decisions than there has ever been. I firmly believe there's plenty of greenwashing out there, but there's also more ability that we have, particularly if you're prepared to take the time to detect the best options and to ask questions of people. And so that transparency is improving. And I think further improvements, David, to your kind of starting question about redefining capitalism, we need things to be even more transparent, in fact, to be much more transparent. And that will help people like you and make good decisions.
I think we're going the right way on transparency, and the audience probably knows there's two task forces running at the G7 at the moment. One is on impact transparency and one is on a just transition standard, which includes a community voice as well as environmental and social outcomes. But one point just before I give the floor to Isabel, to you, and if you're investing with ESGs, is the debate that's going on at the moment on ESGs versus a total portfolio approach, that you, by screening stocks so that each one matches a certain set of outcomes, you're not necessarily doing the best thing as you would be if you looked at the total portfolio and the effect of the total portfolio. Isabel, over to you.
Yeah, I can just support the answers you have already got. It's really important to look at the fine print and look at what ESG investment that you currently have or are seeking to do actually means. If you cannot get answers from the providers that you're assessing, feel free to actually email them or ring them up and ask them, what does it actually mean? What is the outcome that you're achieving by undertaking this? To Rowan's point, there is a lot of greenwashing out there, and it's not a good thing, but you can support it by asking for more transparency, and you can signal how important it is for you, and you can show your appetite that you want to see change. So if you feel the ESG investment opportunities that you currently have got is not providing the answer, or you want to diversify, there may be other reasons for you to look at various opportunities. Go and look at opportunities. what I will just quickly outline what you should be looking for is, what does the option exclude? Are these exclusions aligned with your values, for example? But then on top of it, you want to look at what does it actually mean overall? What else are they doing? Are they integrating social, environmental, and governance aspects throughout their processes, when they identify opportunities and when they engage with companies? And what are the positive outcomes? So the net benefit positive outcomes that they are trying to achieve, because sometimes that may be missing. And it may be an area that you're interested in as well, in addition to exclusion and an integration approach. So these are the 3 areas I encourage you to take look out for. Another area is called stewardship, and it's very much around engagement, basically. Are the companies that you're investing in making that engagement with the companies that they invest in on your behalf for your money? And ask some questions. I really encourage that, because it's really, really important, and it helps shape that outcome that you want to see.
And as you move along the capital spectrum, you go from negative exclusion to ESG ratings to engagement with and activist shareholding, and then to pure impact investing. In the Centre for Sustainable Finance, we are putting together a New Zealand Stewardship Code, and the first draft of that will be ready about the end of November for consultation with the group, and then for the wider public early in the new year. Alex, is there anything you'd like to add to the answers given to Ewan, or?
Yeah, look, Kāinga Ora is actually the biggest issuer of ESG debt in the New Zealand market, in the New Zealand Debt Exchange. We've got a number of billions of dollars of debt outstanding currently, and it is linked back to sustainability and wellbeing related outcomes. So my perspective on this is a little bit of an, I don't want to quite say insider, but seeing it from the perspective of the impact that this type of thing actually has on the organisation. The biggest challenge here is that measuring and reporting outcomes and impacts are not easy. And financial markets have been doing it for centuries, and we have a very mature system for how we report financial performance. Measuring outcomes, every organisation is different. It's extremely difficult to do. So when you're investing in ESG, you're not investing in an outcome, and don't expect to see the organisation be able to tell you what they achieved as a result of your investment. What you are investing in is an organisation where the CFO and where the board care about doing the right thing. And those are actually very important and very important driving forces within an organisation and forcing an organisation to do something differently and better. So I think that's probably where I'd leave that. There is a place for ESG investing. Don't expect to see the organisations be able to tell you exactly what they achieved, but what you should expect is that those organisations have a culture of trying to do things better and trying to do things sustainably.
Thank you, Alex. We have another question, which is regarding housing and investing in property, and as the questioner says, how do we change the Kiwi mentality and the addiction to property investment? And I think that the answer is, well, there's probably numerous different answers. Part of it driven by housing prices, part of it driven by people having sufficient income above what they've invested in housing. But there are all sorts of ways to treat this going forward. Isabel, when you're dealing with people from a savings point of view, how do you manage to persuade them, or how do you advise them on balancing property and other investment?
Yeah, I don't deal with our customers directly. I deal with the companies that we invest in, and I'm asking them those questions. So I may be asking you, Alex, and what it means, what impact they are trying to achieve by putting together sustainability frameworks. I can just talk about what I do personally. So for example, I try to see how much money can I spare each month and in support of an alternative outcome. I think it's really important to not just be invested in a house. I've outlined that earlier, and I think it's really important to have flexibility when you invest in a KiwiSaver, or even if you're deciding to invest in an active series, or like your investment. it gives you flexibility to draw on that money when you need to. It could be hardship, or it could be other aspects that you require throughout your life. You never know what could happen, and I feel it gives you a bit more flexibility than having your house. That's one aspect, but in general also I think it's important to consider what you do when you invest into an investment fund, for example. You're supporting other companies to operate. You're providing employment for those companies that are employing a variety of people. So the money that you're investing is feeding back into a system that we've got. We already discussed the system is not perfect, but if you're deciding to invest with someone who takes social and environmental responsibilities important, then you know they're at least trying to do their best, and they're trying to do their best. Trust us, a lot of people in jobs such as mine, they're always very passionate, and we work relentless to ask companies the right question and making sure that they can have to transition. You can support them on that journey. And it's a really important aspect of redesigning and reimagining capitalism.
Thank you. And Rowan, I suppose when you talk to people about alternatives to housing, this, in selling your climate VC fund, you're trying to help that debate on taking people away from being addicted to property investment.
Yeah, that's right, David. I mean, we talk a lot to people about the fact that if you invest in alternative asset classes like venture capital or private equity, you are giving money to a company or a firm that is going to deliver something, and that's hopefully going to be a direct impact, and you can describe the kind of impact that you're looking for and then invest accordingly. At the other end of the scale, if you buy a block of land in the example that was given, you might make some money, but you've got no other impact. And so I think the key thing I'd be really interested in is it possible to price the externalities of that block of land? There are infrastructure costs to putting, sprawl at the edge of our cities around concrete for water infrastructure and bitumen for roads, and that's often not priced into the value of the block of land. And we know that there've been a couple of attempts at infrastructure levies and the like in New Zealand, but you can bet that they don't take account of the full lifetime emissions value of the house that may one day be built on that land. And if they did, is that something that can be traded upon, something that would effectively incentivize people to go for a smaller block of land, or something that might be an apartment off the plans in the city, rather than something that's contributing to sprawl. So I think a really key concept for me that I kind of get my head around when I think about redefining capitalism is externalities, because they teach you in Economics 101 that the externalities don't matter and just ignore them. We're kind of unpicking that over a very long period of time. And the greenhouse gas emissions part of it for adapting to climate change is actually the easy part, because greenhouse gas emissions are inherently measurable, and therefore you can find a way to trade and price them. I think it's fascinating to try and wonder what this would take, but I don't think that a sort of taxation type regime is coming anytime soon for the sort of block of land purchaser that you're talking about. So I think we need to think pretty flexibly about what the other options could be.
And I think you're absolutely right about the need to price externalities and the need to price them properly. And I used the example early on of, if we price carbon at 170 and oil at 18, but if you turn around and really in the TCFD environment we're coming into next year in New Zealand, if you try and quantify and price your scope 3 emissions, that's going to make a huge change. And one of the changes that I think is driving better environmental climate behavior in New Zealand by companies in particular is where they sit in global company supply chains. So if you're a supplier to Unilever or a supplier to Nestle, you're going to have to conform to the requirements of their supply chain in terms of being able to report emissions, in terms of being able to do last mile deliveries with zero emissions by 2025, which is the case with a number of European companies. So that's going to change the behavior of our companies here. And people are suddenly going to look at what their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are and realize just how much needs to happen in the market. So I think that, and it's linked to the point you made about transparency. I think it's really quite important. And the three of you will be pleased to know that Ewan's pleased with the answers he's received, and Alex, I think, would like to have a chat with you afterwards. But just to finish that, and I've deliberately left you to last, Alex, on the housing question, but is there something you wish to add to what Isabel and Rowan have said about housing or what?
Look, it's a pretty tough one. Again, to reflect on a personal anecdote, I bought my house 3.5 years ago for $800,000 in Wellington, put down $200,000 mortgage on it, capital equity into it, and it's now supposedly worth 1.5 mil. You know, that's a $700,000 return on 200 grand over 3 years, which is pretty hard to shake a stick at, really. So I can totally see the incentive structure there. The problem is that for the vast majority of my friends and acquaintances, it's now impossible for them. They're taking out huge mortgages and buying houses at that new value. So for me, it's actually very bittersweet. Like, oh, cool, I'm wealthier theoretically, but equally, if I want to move, I just have to reinvest in the same market. But for many of my peers, and for my friends and my siblings, it's actually an impossible market for them to get into, which is really difficult. But again, like, the incentive structure has to change. Currently, it is significantly in favour of housing, and that is why we have the market that we do. I wouldn't agree necessarily with a capital gains tax, because I think that effectively penalises supply from coming to the market. Many of the difficulties that we've got with runaway housing price escalation are the fact that people aren't bringing supply into the market. The capital gains tax will only make that worse. But equally, coming back to Rowan's point, why are we not taxing people for owning or holding non-productive assets that have a whole bunch of externalities related to them? And I believe that that's probably what we should be doing. If you're the wealthy approaching pensioner who's holding a large developable piece of land in downtown Wellington, then actually there should be a penalty, a financial penalty on you for owning that land if you're not generating anything productive from it. And at some point in time, there will be a benefit to you of taking that land to market and opening it up for development instead of remaining there. And at the moment, that incentive doesn't exist. I think that's what I would.
Okay. It'd be fun to see you give that argument to an audience at the Wellington Club one day. They might not agree with you. But we have a few minutes left. We have one more question on the Q&A feed, which is, can capitalism deliver prosperity without perpetual growth? And I think this goes to the core of what we're talking about. And if we're talking about redefining capitalism, for most of us, it means a bigger move towards stakeholder capitalism, and the opinions coming out from Minter Ellison and others recently about the position of fiduciary duty. The EU is about to introduce legislation which makes directors take account of the social and environmental consequences of decisions they make. So stakeholder capitalism is creeping in more and more to what we do. If any of you are interested, Paul Pullman, who used to be the CEO of Unilever, had an article in the Harvard Business Review on the Net Positive Manifesto a couple of months ago, where he argues that all companies should make a positive impact on all stakeholders with everything they do, not just environmental, all stakeholders. He said no company in the world is yet net positive, but it is an aspiration. So if we take a minute or a minute and a half, no more than two, Alex, for each of you to sort of wrap up what you think about redesigning capitalism and reimagining it going forward. What would your message be to this question, can capitalism deliver prosperity without perpetual growth? Isabel.
I I was thinking that you would pick me first. I think it can also come back to our question that we had in circular economy. We were talking about profit earlier. We don't necessarily need to invest in products. We can also invest in services. And there's a super amazing example of a company in America that had decided to reduce their impacts on the environment, employ more people, and rent out carpets instead of selling carpets. This is a really good example of combining social, environmental, and wider concept and rethinking a business model. When you think about a donut economy approach, for example, you then take into social aspects into consideration. And it's also a really good framework that we can discuss at length, I'm sure. Perpetual growth, I know what you're thinking around that. And I think it's really important to consider that we have got more than just products that we can deliver as a society. It's really important for us to take everything into account. And I refer back to my introduction that I made earlier. Social and environmental consideration should be taken always into account, but so does economic decision. They should be forming part and parcel of what you decide to do. If we go back to the meaning of what the word economy comes from, econos, it means household. It means household decision around what you're doing on an everyday basis. So when you understand that, and when you go back to the pure meaning, what it means, I think that's when it becomes clearer that we're not that far removed from being there. We can get there if we want to. And it's about small adjustments around the aspects that we want to see more of and the aspects that we want to see less of to support our society the way we want to.
And I think you're right, Isabel. And I think if you talk to CEOs about the circular economy and they say, how can I incentivize my staff if we're supposed to produce less? But there are ways, as you say, to do it. There are ways to improve the overall results for society and for the environment, which ultimately play to people's values as investors and generate better results. Rohan, your closing words.
Thanks, David. And thanks again for the chance to talk with everyone tonight. I agree completely with Isabel about, you can digitize or virtualize products and make them into services. That's been happening for years in the ICT world. And, it's a very successful model. So the question about perpetual growth is, if we mean perpetual growth of value delivered, we can separate that from perpetual growth in resources consumed. We can consume less in terms of physical resources, but still deliver more value for our customers. And that's what I'd be looking for. I think we need to think about timeframes, because we need to move faster on some really big societal issues like climate change, and we're moving way too slowly on that at the moment. But oddly enough, we're all kind of stuck looking at quarterly stock exchange reports because everyone's stuck on a short-term profit motive. So the carpet company that Isabel's referring to, for example, I know that they were a private company at one stage, so they didn't have to go through that ordeal of being put through the ringer by the investment analysts every quarter. They were able to take a longer-term point of view, and that's important. So again, I suppose that takes you towards private asset classes like where I am in venture capital. So I think it's a really interesting question. I think perpetual growth is not something that sounds very good, but I think if you take it in terms of continued innovation and growth in value that's delivered to all stakeholders rather than just to customers, then that's something that we can continue with. But we do need to really make some fundamental changes to the model that we operate our capitalist society under, to make it more transparent, to price the externalities, and to ask of our governments that they do a better job of the regulatory system.
And you create a very interesting question for a separate debate, which is if private companies are better able to take a long-term view, which is healthier for all stakeholders, if companies keep going private, what is the role of the stock exchange in capitalism? But let's not go there just now. Alex, would you like to give a comment on capitalism delivering prosperity without perpetual growth?
Sure. Hey, look, I really agree with Ryan's sentiment there around perpetual growth and being different from growth in price or growth in sort of inputs. To your comment, David, about what does the CE say to their staff? about this transition to a circular economy when they've got to talk about producing less. And I guess my first question would be, well, what are the staff motivated by now? Because there's going to be something in there. And then secondly, it's actually an even greater challenge. We're asking you to produce stuff that can be reused, that is made from stuff that is reused, which is quite different from simply producing less. But I think the key challenge, or the key question, coming back to what I was getting at the start, is can individuals in our society actually feel prosperous without buying all the shit? The endless consumption, the endless purchase of throwaway single-use products that we buy as individuals and consumers as a society to generate some feeling of purpose, value, give our lives a reason or something to enjoy. So I think that's what it's going to take, is actually a rebalancing of the priorities around what it is that individuals and our society actually values, so that growth in value can be delinked from all of the inputs that are so destructive to our environment, and actually to the social structures that create this competition between individuals all trying to stay on the, not quite sure what you call it when the housing market's moving this fast, but I kind of imagine it's like jumping on, trying to grab a rope that's hanging off the back of a yacht. That's what it feels like for people trying to get onto the housing ladder at the moment. You've just got to grab on, because otherwise it's going to go without you. It's really tough. How do we deal with that? I don't know, but I certainly think we need to. Hey, I just wanted to comment on the transition to net neutral as well. This could redefine capitalism, but only if it's designed to, and it certainly could make these things worse. It will take a lot of political will and planning to actually design this transition to net neutral in a way that resolves some of these environmental and social issues. And it will take a lot of bravery and foresight from our politicians to do that in an effective way.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think, unfortunately, there's not enough sign of that happening just at the moment. And then just one closing thought for people to take away in investing and redefining capitalism. When you look at share prices, 90% of most share prices reflects a future value. Look at the price to earnings ratio on which most stocks are trading, and you'll quickly run to the conclusion that stocks are looking at a 20-year long-term horizon. No companies make long-term 20-year plans, and worse than that, most executive incentive plans look out 3 years at most. So we really need to change the way we design systems in incentives and structures to try and deal with some of these issues we're facing. Monique, back to you, and thank you very much indeed.
A huge, huge thank you to the four of you. That was a super interesting conversation, and I'm really sad it's actually just only an hour long. I think that, when we're having these discussions, it's about shifting the dial and about shifting assumptions and going back to definitions such as Isabel did with economy. What is the economy? What do we mean by capital? What is money? And what is labor? We work. What are the fruits of that work? And this has allowed us to, I hope, it definitely has to me, but for others as well, to open my thinking, to take off that another layer in our understanding of our system at the moment, and hopefully be able to shift it towards a much better system. So I agree, Alex, I think we need the systems shift. That means a lot of new things. So thank you all for being here with us this evening. Thank you for all of the participants online. Some great questions coming through as well. And please, if you have any other questions that you want to send through via email, we can always get them to our wonderful speakers and hopefully get answers back to you. So thanks, guys. I was signing out now of day 2 of the summit. Please join us if you are either in the virtual space or in Wanaka here this week. We've got 4 more days to go, and we've got some other big questions that we need to start asking ourselves as well. Tomorrow's all about construction, so we'll see you tomorrow, Alex. Maybe you can serenade us out. Just putting it out there into the ether. The guitar is there.
He's been waiting all session to be asked.
For a treat. Evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Good.
Off you go.
Tonight I am feeling for you under the state of a strange land. You have sacrificed much to be here, therefore the graces I offer my hand. Welcome home, I bid you welcome, bid you welcome. Welcome home from the bottom of my heart. And out here on the edge, the empire is fading by the day, and the world is so weary and war. Maybe we'll find that new way. Keep it coming out, keep it coming out. You'll find most of us here with our hearts wide open. Keep it coming out, keep it coming out, keep it coming out, keep it coming out. Oh, there's a woman with her hands trembling, high head and wide, and she sings with the mountain's memory, high head and wide. There's a cloud the full length of these aisles, just playing chase with the sun. And it's black and it's white and it's a wild, and all the colors are one. So welcome home, I bid you welcome, I bid you welcome. Welcome home from the bottom of our hearts, from the bottom of our hearts. Maybe I'll get it on some practice.
Thanks, everyone. Evening.